What's going on, guys? Welcome to Looking Ahead to Beto Days. I am Chris here with my kick-ass co-host Ryan, bringing you a fully packed show today. But first, Ryan, how are you doing?
Doing great. I'm doing great. Living that pandemic life right now, enjoying the lockdown, and really excited about our show today. We got a great guest today, so let's not waste any time. Retired Colonel Moe Davis. Mr. Davis, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So people may not be aware, you are a congressional candidate for North Carolina's 11th Congressional District. Why don't we just start and just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, who you are, and why you decided to run?
Sure. Yeah, well, thanks. I was born and raised and educated here in North Carolina. I grew up in a small town called Shelby down in Cleveland County. Where I grew up, my dad was a 100% disabled veteran of World War II. He left North Carolina as a healthy young man. He came back 100% disabled. And he was in an accident, a training accident, where a truck flipped over and everybody was thrown clear out of the back except him. The truck landed on his back and broke his back. So when I was a kid growing up, my dad had, back brace and leg braces and a car with hand controls and all that. But I never heard him complain about, leaving here healthy and coming back disabled. He was the commander of the American Legion post in my hometown, which is about an hour from here. I'm in Asheville, but my earliest memories, I'm 61. I can remember like 55, 56 years ago, my dad saying, hop in the car. I'm going to the VA hospital up in Asheville, which is ironic because now I live about a mile from that same hospital, and that's where I go to get my health care. But I grew up here, went to Appalachian State University, North Carolina Central Law School, and then at the age of 25, I joined the Air Force thinking I'd do 4 years and come back home. And 36
it never works out that way.
Yeah, 36 years later, I made it back. But it was an interesting career. I guess I'm best known for having served as chief prosecutor for the terrorism trials at Guantanamo Bay. And I ended up resigning from that. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was reading your background. I realized that because the name. I kind of had the name in the back of my head, and then I saw, I was like, oh, wow, that's the same person. I'd love to just talk to you, your experience with Guantanamo Bay, what that meant for you personally, but, just not only personally, but, I guess in some ways, even politically, because of the very political nature of that position. So I'd just love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, sure. It was I took over in September of 2005. I was the third chief prosecutor. And it was a great team. I had a really good group of folks that worked for me. For an attorney, I can't say it's a once in a lifetime opportunity because most attorneys go a lifetime and never have that opportunity. So it was a really unique experience. And when I came into the job, like I said, I was the third chief prosecutor. There were concerns about my predecessor, and some of the folks on the prosecution team thought he was pushing them to do things that they felt were over the ethical line. So when I came in, there was concern about what's the new guy? What's his policy going to be? Mm-hmm. So first meeting I had with him, I told him, like I said, I'm 61. I can remember, my generation, we grew up looking back at Nuremberg with kind of a sense of reverence. That after World War II, we didn't take the Nazis out and line them up and shoot them. We had trials, and some were convicted, and some were acquitted, and some were executed. But, we looked at it as with some pride that, we did it right. We didn't, we didn't stoop to their level. So I told the team at that first meeting that I wanted us to do Guantanamo in a way that our grandkids would look back at Guantanamo the way we look back at Nuremberg. They'd say, hey, they had, after being attacked, rather than vengeance, they did it right, and they made us proud. So I told them we weren't going to use evidence obtained by torture. And for 2 years, that was the policy until people above me retired and were replaced by political appointees who said, President Bush said we don't torture. Who are you to say we do? And when it became apparent that I wasn't going to be able to prevent the use of tortured evidence, that's when I submitted my resignation from that job. So it was an interesting time, interesting 2 years. And,
it was definitely interesting time. And I just want to thank you personally for that. I don't bring it up often on the show, but I was in the Pentagon for 9/11. So I'm actually a survivor of 9/11. And what you talked about with Nuremberg, about doing it right, doing it without going through torture, doing it, showing America what America's mettle, showing us what America's mettle is, and that we can do this correctly. We don't need to stoop to that level. That was very important to me, because as a soldier at the time, I want to know that I'm a good guy. I'm on the right side of of history, and I'm that my team is the good team. And when we go out there and we torture, that it just erodes that, and it erodes my morale and my spirit that I want to serve. And this was me as an enlisted soldier. That's stuff that it propagates throughout not only the military but the United States as a whole, which is one of the reasons why I was really glad. And I'm kind of going beyond scope here, but the Senate torture report came out later that really, kind of said that we don't do this as a country. Unfortunately, the current administration decided that was to throw that in the bin, but that's another topic altogether. So.
Yeah, but essentially, I think I'm probably the only candidate running anywhere in the country who's endorsed by a former Guantanamo detainee. So,
hey,
I guess that's a good distinction, I guess.
Right?
Yeah. So Mohamedou Slahi, who was wrote a book about his experience there, and Jodie Foster's making a movie out of it now with Benjamin Cumberbatch. But Mohamedou said that I was the kind of American that he thought Americans were, and that he was excited to see I was running for Congress. So
that's actually a pretty good endorsement, actually.
Yeah.
Hey. Can't be.
I'll trade that. One of my opponents, one of the Republicans, is endorsed by Citizens United. I'll take my endorsement over hers.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's interesting. It never had crossed my mind about Nuremberg and the terrorist trials and how well America had actually handled those Nuremberg trials, right? They could have just gone in and killed all the Nazis, but it wouldn't have been justice, right? So Rudolf Hess was part of the Nuremberg trials, but because he jumped into Ireland, I believe. I can't remember if it's England or Ireland. His whole goal was to start a Irish Civil War to throw the English off, by the way. He's actually the last detainee of the Tower of London. But they didn't just kill him because he was a Nazi. He helped Hitler write Mein Kampf, but they treated him like a person. And, there's something to be said for that. And, as a historian, I'd never made that connection. Specifically, a Third Reich, I studied the Jewish experience in the Third Reich and how we handled Nazis and all of that post World War II. So that connection is very intriguing to me. I never even thought about, like, we were better then with Nazis than we were, now without.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, the whole thing with Guantanamo and the military commissions, where you had some, folks that never served in uniform that looked back at the Nazi saboteurs. There were 8 Nazi saboteurs that were captured in the U.S. And at the Justice Department, we used to have meetings down there. There's a room that has a little plaque outside of it that said, this is the site of the trial of the 8 Nazi saboteurs. But those guys were captured in June of 1941 and were convicted, sentenced, and executed by August. And so you had people that looked at that and said, hey, this was swift, it was severe, and it was secret, so let's do that again. So the Bush order that created the military commissions, if you look at the one Roosevelt signed, when I was a law professor, that it'd be called plagiarism, because it was basically they dusted off the order that Roosevelt signed and changed it. And that's basically what Bush signed. And they thought it was going to be the same: swift, severe, and secret. And here we are in 2020, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the guys are still sitting at Guantanamo and still haven't been prosecuted.
And unlikely to be prosecuted at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah, who knows? It's this could have been done in federal court years ago. I mean, I feel bad for the 9/11 victim families that have been denied justice for all these years. Many of them are dying off just from the passage of time, and they could have had justice in federal court. The one detainee that got there in September 2006 was Ahmed Gilani, who was tried in federal court and has been convicted, sentenced to life. His case has been appealed all the way through the Supreme Court, and it's over and done. And the guys he got off the plane with that day are still sitting down at Guantanamo waiting for their day in court.
Wow. So we could spend all day talking about this. I mean, this is I could dig into this with you forever, but the reason why here is that you're running for Congress. So what made you decide to run from Congress after having this, you know, 36 years in the military? Most people just take their pension and retire.
Right. No, it's 25 years.
25, I'm sorry. I thought
actually, after I resigned, I did another year. I was the director of the Air Force Judiciary, and then I retired in October 2008. Then I went on I was a senior specialist in national security for the 111th Congress, and I was head of the Foreign Affairs, Defense, and Trade Division at Congressional Research Service. And then I got fired from that job because after campaigning for Obama, and I was all excited he got elected, when he began to backpedal on Guantanamo, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. It was critical of his handling of Guantanamo, and I got called in the next day and fired for writing the op-ed. So I spent the next 7 years with the help of the ACLU suing the Library of Congress where I worked and fighting the Obama administration, and eventually won that. But in the interim, I taught at Howard University at the law school for 4 years. And then more recently, I was a judge for the Department of Labor and moved down here to Asheville, back home. You know, I always planned to come back home to North Carolina. It just took a while. And so my wife and I moved down here a year ago. We're building a house that hopefully will be done by the end of this month. But in September, I'd finished writing the decisions I had to write to finish up being a judge. I finished that, and I thought I'd retired because I don't know if you followed politics in North Carolina, but we've had a real problem with gerrymandering. And so where I'm sitting right now was represented by Mark Meadows, who I live in Asheville. If you've ever been, Asheville is the coolest city in America.
It's super cool.
We're number 2 in breweries per capita behind Portland, Maine, and we're working hard to catch up.
That's a big selling point.
It is. But Asheville is a very, very, I've described it as the Berkeley of the Blue Ridge. If you picked up Berkeley and brought it east and dropped it in the Appalachian Mountains, it would be Asheville. And so Asheville is very liberal, very progressive, very accepting, and very democratic. And so what the Republicans did when they won the state legislatures, they split it down the middle and put half of Asheville in the district that Mark Meadows represented and half in the district that Patrick McHenry represents. And so September of last year, I'm in that part that was gerrymandered into the McHenry district. And so I thought when I retired, I thought I was retired. And then in late November, the courts here, the state court, remember the U.S. Supreme Court in June of last year said that partisan gerrymandering doesn't violate the U.S. Constitution. And so I thought, no, it's based on North Carolina and Maryland. And I kind of thought it was over and done until the census and the lines got redrawn. But then in November, state courts intervened and told our legislature, either you redraw the lines or we're going to do it for you. And it became apparent that, you know, this county and this city had to get reunited because you couldn't explain splitting it down the middle by any reason other than cheating. And so that's when I looked early December 2nd when it became final, and I looked at it, and there were some great folks running on the Democratic side, but no one that I thought had the ability to compete with Mark Meadows. And you know, after I resigned from the military commissions, I was a regular commentator on MSNBC and CNN and even Fox, and developed a pretty big national following. Like on Twitter, I've got about 158,000 Twitter followers. And I thought, you know, I had the ability to leverage that to be able to effectively compete against Meadows. So that's when I jumped in the race, and I jumped in and Meadows jumped out. And
he jumped out real quick.
And so now we're, and I did it because, I don't know, I looked at it and I said, I've got 25 years in uniform, another 5 years, you know, either working on the Hill in a suit or, you know, in a robe on the bench. And I thought, you know, I've got 30 plus years invested in democracy. I've got too much in it to just sit back and watch it go down the drain. And if I'm not going to do it, who is? So I jumped in, and I was really worried because the other candidates had been running for months, and I had weeks because we were on Super Tuesday. But we managed, with a lot of help from folks around the country who donated, and folks around this district that didn't know me from Adam to begin with, worked really hard, and we ended up winning the primary by a pretty handy margin. So we're really excited about November. We got a real shot for the first time. I mean, with Meadows, when he was here, it was a 30 to 35 point slam dunk. I mean, it was almost a mathematical impossibility for a Democrat. It's still probably a 5 to 10 point Republican leaning district, but that's doable. And
100%.
Yeah, we're really excited.
So,
your district is actually relatively important. I grew up in Virginia, but my entire family is from Asheville. The outlying areas. I think my aunt said outside near Bethel, about 45 minutes outside of Asheville. And I have always said that because I grew up in a family that was extremely hyper Republican. I mean, my family way back 100 years ago were white supremacists, all of this stuff. So it was really important to me, and it's kind of hit home as we were doing our research, that I wanted to come and help and do good, because that's what I've said this entire time. So this is, for me, kind of like a natural starting point, right? Go back to where my family's from, help flip the district and do something about it. I grew up going down there. I love Asheville.
Yeah.
We used to go to Biltmore all the time. It's my grandmother's favorite place. They have a house down there. It's an old family house. But like I said, my whole goal with even starting this podcast has been to make a difference and to right the wrongs of my history. And this gave me a little bit of a sense of pride. And I'm not going to speak to your district because, like I said, I'm still an outsider. Tell us about your district. You told us about how awesome Asheville is. But outside of just the Asheville area, I know there's lots of small towns. Like the town that my great-grandparents lived in, my great-great-grandparents lived in, had 2 people, 2 families.
Yeah, it's really an interesting district. It's all the Blue Ridge Mountains. I guess I took it for granted growing up around here that the whole world was just like this. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing I learned in the military, getting to travel, and see the world, that made me appreciate how great this place is and how beautiful it is. And so that's why I always just, was itching to get back here. But, Asheville, if you've been here, it's just a great city, great restaurants, like I said, breweries, Biltmore State, the French Broad River. Mm-hmm. It's the only river on the East Coast that flows north. But just a wonderful place. But if you go outside of Asheville, 10 miles in any direction, and you've got Confederate flags and Trump stickers, and it's a whole different area. So it's an interesting place to run for office, because in Asheville, I could not be liberal enough. If I'm 100 yards left of Bernie Sanders, would be perfectly fine in Asheville. But you go 10 miles in either direction, and that doesn't play well. Sure. And so trying to thread the needle, because you can't win on just Asheville and Buncombe County. You've got to have some of those votes from the other rural counties where folks aren't as progressive. And so that's what I've tried to do, is kind of carve out I don't want to run on something that I don't believe in. And so, like in the primary, I said that, I hate people that they run in the primary and they say one thing and then they do the pivot, to do something different to try to win the general election. I said, that's just not right. I want to tell you what I believe in, and I want to run on policies that, I can support, without and so that's what I tried to do. And I think I've done, on issues, I've found, like, I guess a lot of folks have, that they're litmus test issues. And clearly here, guns and abortion are those issues where you either have the right answer or the wrong answer. There's no shades of gray.
There's no in between.
No.
Yeah. So I've tried to carve out, I've tried to, I think the positions I've taken, a lot of issues don't make either side particularly happy. And that's probably where we need to be, because it's going to take, we got to have a majority to win.
Sure.
Absolutely.
But the good thing about it is that, I think despite what we see online and what we see in the TV, Americans are a lot closer together on a lot of issues. And, You know, so and I'd love to talk about some of the some of your platform. Specifically, the one that stood out to me was Veterans Affairs issues. That's something that's actually personal to me, especially when you start talking about suicide prevention, and more critically to me, just getting soldiers and sailors the help they need. That's something we've talked about on the show before, which is, you know, a lot of people, especially enlisted, are coming out of the military, and they've come from this very rigid environment where everything is pretty much spoon-fed to you. It's really hard to screw something up, it kind of is. But when you get out, suddenly you're dealing with the VA, which is this huge sprawling bureaucracy, and it's not spoon-fed to you. You really got to try and challenge to make it work, and be aggressive in your care and getting some. And it's kind of caused a challenge. It's caused a lot of issues with people falling through the cracks, not getting the care they need. It's not because we don't necessarily have a desire to provide the care, but we just don't seem to have an effective way to get it to the people who need it. And so that's something that really stood out to me. So I'd love to hear, what you intend to try and do to address that challenge with veterans.
Right. Yeah, well, we're very fortunate here in Asheville. Like I said, my dad used to come here 55, 60 years ago, for his medical care, and that's where I go now. And we're fortunate to have one of the highest rated VA hospitals in the country right here in Asheville. And I'd never used the VA. I was entitled to it, since I retired in 2008. But when I was working lived in Northern Virginia and working in DC, it just there wasn't a convenient VA hospital to get to, so I didn't use it till I moved here. But they've taken great care of me, and so that's one thing that on the back of my car, I've got the Save the VA sticker on the back of my car, because veterans kept their commitment to the country, and the country owes it to them to keep their commitment to the veterans. So the Republicans, they want to privatize and profitize everything, like prisons, education, and veterans health care. So there's been this push to privatize the VA. And so that's one of the key things I'm running on, is keeping the VA the way it was supposed to be. And, people, it's funny too, because, when I go to the VA, to the hospital, not now, I can't go because of COVID-19, but back before COVID-19.
Back in the before.
Like in January, I had a hip injury. I just turned one. When you get old age is not for sissies, I'm learning. I turned and my hip popped. I had a hip problem for a while. I'd gone to the VA, and my wife, I was sitting in the lobby. My wife had gone to get the car to pull up to the front, because I was walking with a cane. And as I was sitting there, if you look around the lobby, I would say, half the guys have a MAGA cap and a Trump sticker. And I've never been able to square that circle on how you can be a veteran and support the most immoral, incompetent, and corrupt president in American history. But there were two older guys sitting there in their Vietnam vet caps. And I instantly drew an assumption about them, that they were, had drank the Kool-Aid and were hopeless. But as I'm sitting there, the one guy he was talking to the other one. He said, we got to get Trump reelected. He, got to get 4 more years. He's doing great things for veterans and for the economy. And the other guy looked at him, and I was expecting him to say, yeah, you're right. Instead, he said, somebody fed you a line of bullshit. He said, we were better off under Obama. Trump's pitted us against each other. And so anyway, I had to get up and leave. But there are 2 things I took away from that. Number one is I shouldn't assume based on appearances what a person's beliefs are, because I had written them both off. And number 2, the guy that was the Trump supporter, I don't know if I doubt the other guy sold him on the, but he was nodding along and listening to facts because it was one of his peers talking to him. So there's 65,000 veterans in this district. And I'd say the vast majority believe in the VA. And I'm one of them. So my opponents on the Republican side, neither one of them ever served a day in the military. So when I go out to the VFW in Tuckasegee, I'm one of those guys. When I go to the DAV, I'm a member. So I can get in the door, and hopefully we've got to win some of those people over to win this election. And I think I've got the ability to do that because I am one of those guys. And so we're going to fight hard to keep the VA as it is and stop this effort to find the profit margin in every aspect of life. There's some things that are fundamental, inherent government responsibilities, like prisons. And I think VA healthcare falls in that category too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I heard you mention education in there, which I feel I'm a teacher. That is my day job. I teach. And that was when I was going through all of your policies. That was the thing that popped out to me. And the one thing that really struck me was your plan for student loans. I'm very much in the belief that the student loan bubble will be the next bubble to pop, because we have so much student loan debt, and we have people who can't get jobs doing it, or using their degrees. And your plan was relatively genius. The idea of and we actually had a conversation about this last night, that the government, it isn't necessarily like free education, it's an investment almost. It's more macroeconomics, it's human capital. How did you come up with that plan? It's such a good plan. I'm surprised I haven't seen it more broadly across the country. And it comes from your experiences in the military. I read where it said you would tell your students join the military. Same kind of idea.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I'm a big believer in education, and I view it as an investment, not an expense. And again, it's another area where the other side wants to privatize and profitize education. And I can tell you, like my two opponents on the other side, I went through first grade through high school in Shelby in the public schools. I went to Appalachian State for 4 years for my undergraduate degree, which is a public, part of the UNC public university system. And then I spent 3 years at North Carolina Central, which is also part of that system, in law school. So I've got 19 years in the public school system here in North Carolina, where my two opponents, one was homeschooled and the other, she was born and raised in New Hampshire and then moved down here. So I'm the only candidate running who actually has experience in the public school system. But again, I think it's foolish to not view this as an investment, because giving those, our kids the background and the ability to be full up members of society and that new frontier that's ahead of us, that's what's going to, this part of our future is tied to their future. So I view it as an investment. And I saw, like you mentioned, I was a professor at Howard University at the law school, and I had a number of students. There were several that I helped get into the JAG Corps. Some, I was in the Air Force, so I tend to, now to me is the better branch. I've tried to push them that way, but somewhat,
go Army.
somewhat to the Army, somewhat to the Navy, and I don't fault them for that. But I helped, I don't know, quite a few of my students that wanted to serve in the military and wanted to make the JAG Corps a career. I was able to help them do that. But I had a number of others that came to talk to me about it, either joining the JAG Corps or some other form of public service, the Peace Corps, or, some other form of public service. And they weren't able to do it because they had so much debt, student loan debt, that they were forced not to do what they were passionate about, but to do what was going to give them the biggest paycheck so they could afford to pay back their student loans. So I look at it, and to me, it's a drag on our economy, because you have a lot of young people that they're deferring getting married, they're deferring having families, deferring buying houses, deferring doing what they were passionate about because they're saddled with so much debt. So I know during the primary, I met a young lady who was saying that all she could afford to pay was the interest, not the principal. And 100%. So she said, I don't think I'll ever live long enough to pay off the debt. All I can afford to do to keep my head above water is pay the interest every month and kick the can down the road. I met another young man, or not young, he was probably in his 30s during the primary, who went to Appalachian State like I did, and stayed and got a master's in education and was a school teacher, but he quit and got a job in a factory because it paid more and had better benefits than being a teacher in North Carolina.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so he had a job working in a factory that didn't even require a high school diploma. Mm-hmm. And here's a guy with a master's degree who wasn't doing what he was passionate about, which was teaching. He had to quit that job to, to feed his family and take care of them. So, I think it was Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren had the plan to totally forgive student loan debt. I think it's $1.6 trillion, which a few months ago seemed like a huge sum of money, just one you choke on. But, as we've seen during COVID-19, a trillion here, a trillion there, it's
no big deal.
It's doable. Yeah. Well, that's like, I was looking, between April the 8th and May the 7th, which is a 30-day period, we added over $1 trillion to the national debt, which, in part because of COVID-19. So 1.6 trillion is a huge number, but it's doable. But on one hand, I've known people that, when I was in college, I had I worked to help, support myself. And I knew other people that worked 2 jobs, while going to school, so that they weren't saddled with a bunch of debt. So to totally excuse $1.6 trillion in debt, to me, was kind of a poke in the eye to folks that had, really busted their butt to, avoid having the debt. But on the other hand, it is a drag on the economy. And like my students, some of them, it was, wasn't through, weren't lazy. It was, they just accumulated all this debt. So to me, a middle ground was for the government to buy that debt from private, because right now it's through private lenders. So the government buys the debt, it becomes a government debt that students or people pay back at 0 interest. Mm-hmm. And with an option to where you can also pay it back through some form of public service. So like the military or being a teacher or the Peace Corps, you could pay off your debt by public service. And to me, that kind of struck a reasonable middle ground to where, the people that did work hard, it's not really a poke in the eye to them. But for folks that are saddled with debt, it lifts a lot of that burden off of them and makes it manageable. So to me, it seemed like a sensible plan. So I'm a big believer in education. And I don't know if you followed here in North Carolina, our teachers here are, grossly underpaid. They're not paid like the professionals that they ought to be.
Absolutely.
I was really happy I was real pleased, back to the VA. I'm happy to be endorsed by Vote Vets. I'm also happy to be endorsed by the North Carolina Association of Educators. Because, like I said, I'm the only one running for this seat that has any experience with public education. In fact, the lady that Mark Meadows is endorsed said that our public schools are liberal indoctrination centers.
Oh,
Lord. Yeah, so she's a big believer in church schools and homeschools, and
there's no substitute for public education.
Right.
And I'm going to touch on a couple of things that you had mentioned. One, teachers are grossly underpaid. Like, we're literally the foundation for what America is going to become. Without us, there is no America, right? We very quickly descend into idiocracy because people don't know. And you can see what happens when you have poor education. People are more apt to buy into bullshit, right? You can tell me anything if I don't know any better. And so that's why teachers are so important. That's actually, I have it written down on my piece of paper to talk to you about teacher pay and, different ways we can fix that, because teachers are also not, when you hear people, they talk about first responders, they talk about nurses, they talk about everything. But teachers kind of always get left out. And, and I'm not saying that those guys aren't important. All of that is super, super important, but you can't highlight one and leave the rest of us out kind of in the dark. I work Monday through Friday, busting my butt to make sure kids are educated. Having to adjust on the fly to make sure my kids are taken care of, and we're not compensated the way that we should. And you don't hear as much argument. It's not as loud to make sure teachers are compensated. I'm buried in student loan debt to become a teacher. I will never stop teaching because that is what I do. But we lose a lot of good teachers to lack of pay. So how do we go about fixing that?
Yeah, I think I agree. And I've got members of my family that were career educators here in North Carolina. It was, to me, being a teacher is like serving in the military. It's something, you don't do it to get rich. You do it because you believe you're doing something that matters.
Exactly.
You are. And I hope COVID-19 has impressed upon a lot of people whose kids are at home and, you know, they're having to try to be substitute teachers. I think I've seen a number of folks in social media that have said they've got newfound respect for teachers, because when they've had to take on that role, they found it to be a really daunting task. So, you know, education is primarily a state and a local issue. So you know, particularly like running for Congress, I think there are a couple things that from the federal level that we can do that would help on the state and local level. I tell you, one of the problems we've got here, let me back up just a bit, in this district, you know, we're the western part of North Carolina. There was an article towards the end of last year that said that the rural schools, that the kids in the rural schools in the state rank in the bottom third of the country in math and reading. When I grew up in North Carolina, we were a proud, progressive, forward-leaning state back in the 60s and 70s when I was in school. And, you know, we had Research Triangle Park before anybody ever heard of Silicon Valley. So North Carolina at one point was kind of a model, the envy of the South. And then for the last decade or so, we've had folks want to roll back the clock and take us in a different direction. So I want to get us back to being that proud progressive state that we used to be, where our education system was a great system. So the two things I think we can do from the federal level to help. Well, let me back up again. I keep jumping around here. The kids in those rural schools, the average public funding for students, the average in North Carolina is about $1,600 per student. Now, there are areas like Research Triangle, Hillsborough, Durham, down in that area, where it's over $10,000 per student. So that's in a very you know, a wealthy area where they can afford to put a bigger investment into their school systems. We have systems here in the western part of this district where the average is about $400 per student. So it's 1/4 of the state average and a fraction of what, you know, the elite, more, you know, wealthy counties are investing in their students. So Title I funding is, you know, Title I is funding that helps areas of high poverty to help bring them up to closer to par. So it's one of those areas that there's a lot of talk about it, but not a lot of effort to actually beef it up. So I think from the federal level, I would like to fight to get greater Title I funding to help those areas of high poverty, to bring them up closer to the norm on funding. Another thing I think we can do from the federal level, there seems to be bipartisan or nonpartisan support for infrastructure spending. And I would like to see that targeted on areas of high poverty and specifically on education. So to build schools, to maintain schools. And one of the important things out here is to bring broadband. A lot of the urban areas, you know, during this COVID-19 crisis, kids have been able to do some online learning. I was talking to some teachers in this district, and they said, you know, when their kids got sent home, they were given Chromebooks to take home with them, which that's great. But if you live in one of the counties in this district where the broadband access rate is 50%, you know, that Chromebook is a big paperweight if you can't get on the internet.
Exactly.
So, you know, the national average, about 92% of Americans have broadband access. North Carolina is 94%. But we have counties in this district where the broadband access rate is 50 to 60%. So I would like to see a bigger investment, an infrastructure investment in bringing broadband. And we can go off on a whole conversation on broadband, because that impacts not just education, but employment, healthcare. A number of things tie into the broadband issue as well. But those are a couple of things I think I could do from the federal level to try to help enhance education in this district.
Well, I mean, all of that stuff is national too. It's not that goes outside of the would even go outside of your district to help teachers nationwide. I think we dropped Ryan, which is totally just fine. He'll hop back in. He's in Galveston. His internet is just spotty. All right, we got Ryan back. We can totally wrap this out, and I'll edit out our side conversation there.
We're just talking about broadband. We got to get you some broadband access.
So I actually live on an island in the middle of the Gulf. So unfortunately, there's only one pipe in and out. I have limited options.
That's funny. Normally, I don't edit out stuff. I just leave it in there because the whole amateur thing. But I'll edit all this stuff out.
I'm sorry about that.
So let's go ahead and dive into some current events, because we're all trapped in our houses and there's life still going on, and unfortunately our government has done a fantastic job of just fucking that all up, and now everything's Obama's fault. So but before we get into that, I know Ryan wanted to talk to you about Captain Crozier.
Yeah, so I'm very curious because, for people who don't know, you're a colonel, he was a captain. That's the same rank, believe it or not. It's the Navy,
right.
Air Force. So basically, talking about one of your peers, and it was always struck me, personally, I very firmly believe in what Captain Crozier did. I think it took a lot of bravery. He sacrificed his career, and he knew he was sacrificing his career when he wrote that letter. Now, and him getting fired isn't entirely surprising. What was surprising to me was the way it went about happening, with Secretary of the Navy, Thomas Moldy, basically flying out there and going on and basically trashing the former commander to all his soldiers. So I'd really like to get your perspective, especially as someone who's been in that position of that rank. And so kind of get your perspective as far as the military leadership that was demonstrated. And who do you think ultimately demonstrated the best leadership abilities in that regard?
Yeah, well, I think, the clear indicator is you saw when he left the ship, all the sailors that came out, and that was a testament to his leadership, that they knew that their captain took care of them and put them ahead of his own interest. And that's what leaders do. So I was really proud of, I think, his was on a much bigger scale. It's kind of like, this decision I faced on torture. I had a group of, I was the chief prosecutor. So all the folks under me were junior to me. Many of them, had families and were midway through their careers. And, it's kind of one of those situations, if I wasn't going to stand up and throw the bullshit flag on torture, who was? Mm-hmm. And I looked at it too, it's like, what are they going to do to me? I'm a colonel. Being forced to retire as a colonel is not the worst thing in the world to happen to you. But, it was, if I wasn't going to do it, who was? And I think Captain Crozier is in the same thing. We're looking out for his troops. If he wasn't going to raise the flag and say, hey, we've got to do something about this, who was? And so he did. And I think the reaction of his troops, his sailors, speaks volumes about what they thought about, his character and his leadership. And contrast that with, like, I know this morning on Twitter, Trump's has Twitteria again. And
2 days in a row.
Yeah. But he had one this morning. We were talking about the governors, about how they ought to be, they're getting all the credit for doing a great job, but it was really him and his efforts. And, leaders don't do that. Donald Trump has never taken responsibility for anything in his life. He's always, it's Obama's fault, it's Hillary's fault, it's, China's fault, it's everybody's fault but him. What I found, leaders take responsibility for their actions. Mm-hmm. And one thing I found is a leader, you make sure the people that did the work get the credit when things go right. And you don't throw them under the bus when things go wrong. Unless my policy was, if somebody I expect you to screw up. If you're not screwing up, you're not trying. But if it's an honest mistake, then you don't throw them under the bus for it. Now, they repeat it and keep making it. It's a different story. But, Trump is the counter argument for leadership. I mean, he is everything leaders are not. So Crozier was a prime example of what leadership looks like. Mm-hmm. It's putting the good of your organization and the folks that you're responsible for ahead of yourself. And I would love to see, and I'm drawing a blank on the current Secretary of the Navy, who I know because he was the Judge Advocate General of the Navy when I was the Chief Prosecutor. Mm-hmm. And I used to meet with the TJAGs on a regular basis and brief them on what we were doing with the military, because they were opposed as I said, the civilian leadership are the ones that pushed torture in Guantanamo and military commissions. The uniform folks were routinely against it. So again, I'm drawing a blank, but I can tell you that
Richard Spencer, I believe. Is that right?
I don't think it's Spencer. It's God. What can I think?
They've changed different positions so many times. It's hard to keep track of them.
Well, the current acting secretary is the former Judge Advocate General of the Navy, and I can tell you that back in 2006, 2007, he was on the McPherson. Thank you. He was on the right side of the torture issue and was willing to push back against the Bush administration on torture. So I'd love to see him step up here and do the right thing and put Crozier back on the ship. Can you imagine the reaction of the sailors?
So Crozier has since been reinstated, I believe. I remember reading that recently.
Well, I think they held up. That was the recommendation of the Chief of Staff of the Navy, the uniform side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think they, on the civilian side, the Secretary of Defense and the civilian Trump-appointed leadership said we need to have further investigation.
Yeah, no, that's they made the recommendation. They have not put him back on the ship, and I'm with you. I would love to see the reaction from his men when he steps foot back on that ship. It's created such a dichotomy, and like not a dichotomy, but like a parallel between what Trump is and what leadership is, and I think you summed that up very, very nicely, and that definitely is going to be what echoes from the pandemic in general, is how leadership failed all of us. And after November, because we're still going to be dealing with this for years, what do we do next with the pandemic when we bring in a new Congress? How do we get America actually back on its feet without saying we're doing a tremendous job, everybody's the best job? How do we move forward? How does our leadership move forward rather? And fix the damage?
Yeah, it's going to take, that's one thing. I won't live long enough to see us undo the damage we've done in foreign affairs, for example. Because like I spent most of my career, adult life, in national security matters, either in uniform or working for government. And the damage we've done, will take decades to repair, like abandoning the Kurds. After they fought and died for us in Syria, against ISIS, why would anybody ever trust us again? Attacking NATO and constantly undermining NATO and siding with Putin and Kim Jong-un, and it's going to take decades to restore the damage that we've done over the last few years. But we've got to start, and that's one thing I want to be a part of. Is I think I've said throughout the primary, I'm not looking. This for me is not a springboard to another job or something where I want to go there and home. It used to bother me when I worked for Congress. You had some members had been there so long that people literally had to pick them up by the elbow and get them to their seat.
Yeah, Strom Thurmond was there forever. Dude ran for president in 1948, was in Congress when he died in like 2003.
Yeah, I'm not doing that. I want to be there for a couple of terms, get us back on an even keel and in the right direction, and then I am perfectly happy to come back here, sit on my porch, and drink beer and enjoy Asheville. But
absolutely.
So for me, it's not a stepping stone. We got to start the process, and part of that process is restoring integrity and accountability. Congress is supposed to be a co-equal branch and a check and balance. It's interesting. I guess as we're talking right now, the Supreme Court's hearing oral argument on the whether Trump has to comply with the congressional subpoenas. Congress has advocated its responsibility to be a check on the executive branch, and particularly the Senate. I mean, Mitt Romney was the one Republican that actually had the integrity to do the right thing, and we've got to start by. That's what people have asked. What's the most important issue? And often, we talk about healthcare and education and the environment and jobs and all that. To me, the most important issue is restoring integrity and accountability, because people ought to be able to believe that their government is there acting in their best interest. And right now, the other side of the propaganda and Fox News and, all that has just so eroded trust in government. I can tell you, like I said, I retired in September of last year from the Department of Labor, and used to being a government employee was an honorable career, that you could be proud of. You weren't going to get rich doing it, but you felt like you were doing something that mattered. And Trump has so vilified and demoralized federal employees that we've got to reverse that. So that's why I'm running, and why I think it's important to start a new chapter. We can't continue. I'm afraid 4 more years of Trump, we won't have a country left.
Oh, I agree. I've been saying the same thing. I don't see us surviving another 4 years, and that's why we can start by bringing integrity back to our country in November. We can all get out and vote by any means possible. If we can't vote by mail, crawl, whatever it takes, over broken glass through the gates of hell, get to a polling station. We all have to be there to make a change, to bring back integrity to this country. Colonel Davis, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming on. Appreciate it.
I've learned you've been a fantastic guest. I've learned so much just from sitting here talking to you. You're welcome back anytime you want to come hang out. You're more than welcome.
Thanks. Well, you guys have to come to Asheville. Like I said, when this is over, come back. We'll try to hit as many of the breweries as we can. And the motto here is keep Asheville weird. And I'm committed to doing my part. I'm committed to doing my part.
All right, guys. Let's keep on staying home. Let's keep on staying safe, and let's keep on looking ahead to better days.